This week's parasha, Parshas Vayikra, deals with the Karbonos. And there's a Perek Daled, which is devoted to the carbon chatas. The carbon that's brought as an atonement for certain types of averis. The rule is that the carbon chatas is brought if the aveira is done b'shogeg, it's done inadvertently. If it's done deliberately, there's no carbon chatas. And the nature of the sin must be the type of sin for which a person would be liable for kares if the person had done it deliberately. So the type of act for which a person is chayav kares, had he done the aveira b'mezid, deliberately, if he does it b'shogeg, he brings a carbon chatas. So for example, if a person eats chaylev, forbidden fat, blood, commits one of the forms of incest in the Torah. So these are aveiros which, if you do them deliberately, you're chayav kares. Do them inadvertently, you're chayav carbon chatas. And the question is, what is the idea of obligating a person to bring a carbon for something he did by accident? And it's an accident. It's a mistake. So why should he bring a carbon? The Rabbi Eliezer writes that carelessness is also a sin. When you made a mistake, you're not supposed to make a mistake. You're supposed to pay attention. You're supposed to not forget. And the Rabbi Eliezer writes that the chatas is really a punishment. It is a monetary fine of sorts. We're not talking about something which is mystical or metaphysical. It's a down-to-earth penalty. Because you committed a crime, committed a sin, carelessness is also a sin, you have to pay a penalty. In this case, the penalty is to bring a carbon. But he understands it as an onesh moment. He calls it a monetary punishment. Now the question, of course, is that if carelessness is a crime, it should be a crime no matter what the aveira is. Why is it specifically an aveira which, had it been done b'mezid, it would be a chiyav kares? And what if it's an aveira which is a lighter aveira, for which there would be no kares? Still, carelessness is a sin. Rav Hirsch addresses this question, and he writes very interestingly. He writes that you can't say that carelessness as a rule is a sin. Shkiyais miyavin, the pasuk says, that who can avoid all mistakes? People are human; they make mistakes. If the issue is a very, very severe issue, so there's a special obligation to be careful, and there we can charge you for making a mistake. So if it's a lesser sin, you made a mistake. People make mistakes. But we're dealing with something of vital importance. It's an aveira which is a chiyav kares. That type of aveira, you can't make a mistake. There, if you are careless, there is a grievance against you for which you have to pay this penalty. Now the problem is that there are other aveiros which are more chamor than the chiyav kares. There are aveiros which are chayvei misas bezdin, which are liable for capital punishment, murder, kidnapping, and the Gemara tells us in many places that misas bezdin is more chamor than kares, and yet you don't bring a carbon chatas. If the theory goes that the more severe the sin, the more liable you are for your mistakes, and the chatas is really a punishment, then there should be a chiyav chatas for those aveiros for which there is misas bezdin, even though there's no kares. The Rav Hirsch seems to notice this problem, and he gives a second explanation. And he makes an amazing observation. He says that if you study the various sins for which there is kares, for which there is only misas bezdin, you discover an interesting thing. That particularly Jewish sins that violate a Jewish standard, there's a chiyav kares. Aveiros, which are violations of a human standard, there you have misas bezdin without kares. For example, murder. Murder is not a Jewish crime. Murder is a human crime. Kidnapping is not a Jewish crime. Kidnapping is a human crime. So for those aveiros, you have misas bezdin with no kares. The isurim for which there is kares usually are crimes that are specific to our religion. And therefore he says that in a sense, that makes them more chamor. They're more chamor, they're more severe, because they are associated with our Jewishness as opposed to merely being human values. And therefore, although in another sense it's true that misas bezdin is more chamor than kares, there is a special chumra, a special severity in the chayvik misus which would justify why there we expect you not to be careless. This is the approach that the Rabbi takes, and I think Rav Hirsch follows in his footsteps and comes to answer this question. The Ramban in our parsha takes a different approach. The Ramban understands that the question of a carbon chata is not a punishment at all. It isn't a punishment for carelessness. The idea is, says the Ramban, because kol ha'averos yolidu gnai b'nefesh. The nature of the sinful thing is that it causes a defect. It causes a flaw in the neshama of the person. Because if you eat chaylev, if you eat dam, if you commit one of the arayas, even if you're, in a sense, blameless, but the nature of the act is that it creates an imperfection in one's soul, which will have consequences in the long run. The Ramban says that after 120 years, when you're meant to go to Olam Haba and apprehend the divine presence, the Shekhinah, you're going to be unable to fully apprehend what you are meant to apprehend because of this pagam, this defect that has been introduced into the neshama. And therefore the purpose of the carbon chatas is to cleanse the soul in order that it be able to fully receive the Shekhinah, the divine presence, in the next world. So it's not a punishment per se, it's a cleansing. It's a cleansing. The nature of the Aveira, the nature of the Isser, introduces this spiritual stain, and that requires cleansing, and that's what the carbon chatas is meant to do. But if you look carefully in the Lashon of the Ramban says, Kol ha'aveiros yolidu b'nefesh. All aveiros have this. It's not only aveiros that are chai v'krisus. All aveiros have this tendency that they introduce a gnai b'nefesh, a defect into the soul. So again, the question bounces back that if we're not talking about a punishment, if we're talking about a cleansing, why should there be a distinction between the aveiros for which there's no chiyuv kares and for which there is a chiyuv kares? Again, if we're dealing with a punishment because we hold you responsible, we blame you, so then you can argue that perhaps for the garden variety mistake, we don't hold you responsible. For a mistake that pertains to a very severe aveira, we will hold you responsible. But if we look at it as a cleansing, it's an opportunity, it's not a punishment. So why don't we provide this opportunity for any aveira? Right? Even if it's an aveira which is not a chiyuv kares. But if you have an opportunity to cleanse yourself of the pagam, the Torah should require us to do so. Because according to the Ramban's interpretation, why is this specifically those aveiros for which there's a chiyuv kares? So it would seem to say that the pagam, the defect which a chiyuv kares introduces into the soul, is a more severe pagam than the pagam that's introduced by a lesser sin. So we have to explore what is the nature, what is the difference between the pagam that the soul receives from this type of aveira as opposed to the pagam the soul receives from lesser sins. We're going to explore that tonight. Now, another interesting thing that we have to reflect on is that, okay, we understand what the purpose of the carbon chatas is. How does the carbon chatas actually do this? In other words, how does the ritual of chatas actually affect cleansing? There seems to be a tendency in the Rishonim, the Rambam, the Abarbanel, Rav Hirsch later, to understand that all the rituals that are associated not only with the chatas, with all karbonos, are symbolic. Meaning the real cleansing doesn't come from the carbon, it comes from reflection upon what the carbon symbolizes. As you bring the carbon symbolizes certain ideas, and if you take those ideas to heart, you become cleansed thereby. It's not the carbon that does the cleansing, it's the reflection, it's the thinking about the ideas which the carbon symbolizes. So what does the carbon chatas symbolize? The rituals associated with the chatas. And specifically, there are two facets which are very interesting. The Torah talks about 5 different types of carbon chatas. The first is called the par kohen Mashiach, a par which is brought by the kohen gadol if he sins. The second is called the par helen davar shel tzibur. It's a par that's brought by the Sanhedrin if they issue an erroneous ruling, and as a result the majority of the tzibur sins. In those two instances, the fat is burnt on the mizbeach, but the meat, the bodies of the animals, are actually burnt outside of the camp. Totally burnt. Not on the mizbeach like a carbon oil. On the mizbeach, only the amorim, only the fat and the kidneys are burnt. But the rest of the animal is taken out, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and it's burnt. When it comes to the other forms of carbon chatas, for example, the chatas of the king, the nasi, or the two types of chatas that a private individual brings, either of a sheep or of a goat, there the Torah says that the meat is eaten by the Kohanim. So how do we understand that? What is the symbolism of the meat being burnt as opposed to the meat being eaten? What are the symbols that are being conveyed over here, and how do they relate to the message, the lesson that the carbon chatas is coming to send? A third very interesting thing is that the Gemara tells us that B'zman hazeh, nowadays, there are things that can replace the carbon chatas. The Gemara says in Maseches Brachos, Maseches Chagiga, that when we had a Beis HaMikdash, the Mizbeach was mechaper. Achshav, B'zman hazeh, shulchano shlo mechaper. A person's table is mechaper. How so? If you invite the poor to eat at your table, you have a kapara. Which seems to be that the kapara, the atonement that once upon a time we had with karbonos, we could now have with chesed, with kindness, extending charity to the poor. The truth is that this is a Rabbi Yonah in the Sharei Tshuva who says this. Now the Gemara says in Maseches Yuma that if a person commits an aveira for which he is chayav karas, let's say he does it b'mezid even, deliberately, and he does tshuva, he does not have a kapara immediately, even though he did tshuva, until he experiences yisurin, experiences suffering. But tshuva alone doesn't complete the kapara. It's interesting, as an aside, Rabbi Yonah in the Sharei Tshuva says, how do I know this? How do Chazal know that in addition to tshuva you need something extra? So Rabbi Yonah says you learn it from the halacha of carbon chatas. Because from carbon chatas you see an amazing thing. If a person did this aveira even b'shogeg, even inadvertently, and did tshuva, it's not enough. Because a carbon chatas is only mechaper with tshuva. And if you did tshuva, so why do you need the carbon? So apparently, the tshuva alone isn't enough. Even with the tshuva, you need to have the carbon. So I see, even if you do it b'shogeg, tshuva isn't enough. Kal v'chayim, if you do it b'mezid, tshuva isn't enough. But there you don't have the option of bringing the carbon, because it's amazing. So there the Gemara says it's yisurin, it's suffering, physical afflictions that complete the kapara. So if you do it b'shogeg, you have the carbon chatas. You do it b'mezid, physical afflictions. You have to understand, how does physical affliction affect cleansing? That's another good question. But Rabbi Yonah says in the Sharei Tshuva that there's a substitute for the physical afflictions. He brings a pasuk in Mishnah which says, "B'chesed ve'emes yichupar avayin." A person can have an atonement with chesed, with kindness. And Rabbi Yonah says that the requirement of suffering that one needs for a kapara, one can replace with acts of kindness. For some people, acts of kindness is suffering. They don't want to give. But even putting that aside, somehow you can replace the requirement of yisurin, of suffering, with acts of chesed. How does that work? Why should that be? Let's put all the questions in the back burner. Let's talk about a medrash. The medrash rabbah on this parak, and the parak of the carbon chatas, tells a story. It says there once was a king who had an orchard. And in the orchard there were beautiful fig trees. And he was scared that people would steal the fig trees, so he appointed watchmen. So he appointed 2 watchmen. For he was scared, maybe the watchmen themselves will steal the figs. So he appointed 2 watchmen. One was lame, and the other was blind. And this way he figured it's safe. The lame one can't walk to the fig trees. The blind one can't even see the fig trees. So they're safe. So the 2 chevra got together and he said, listen, Says, we can do this together. So the blind man can walk, just can't be guided. So the lame person told the blind man, carry me on your shoulders. I will direct you, because I can see, I can't walk, but I can see. So I will guide you. You'll walk towards the figs, and we'll take the figs. So sure enough, the two of them together stole all the figs. The king comes back, all the figs are gone. So he comes to them, and he accuses them of having stolen the figs. So the blind one says, me? I stole the figs? I can't even see where I'm going. And the lame one says, me? I stole the figs? I can't walk. So what did the king do? The king put the lame man on the shoulders of the blind one, and he beat them both. In other words, he put them together and showed how they could have done the crime. So Kach, says the Gemara, says the Medrash, this is a mashal for what's going to be in the next world. It says, when a person is put on trial in the next world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will go to the neshama and accuse the neshama. You did Averis. The neshama will say, me? I didn't Averis. It says, from the time that I departed my body, I'm like a bird. I fly around. I have no interest in the things of this world. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, he goes to the body, accuses the body of doing Averis. The body says, you're accusing me? From the time the soul departed, I'm like a lump of stone. Can't move, can't do anything. So it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time of the Tchias HaMesim, puts the soul back into the body, and now they're together, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu punishes them both. Now, the truth is this mashal, the Gemara brings in Sanhedrin and Parachelek, as a mashal for the Tchias HaMesim. The Gemara says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to be mechayed the mesim. He has to bring the dead back to life in order to judge them. So why is it necessary to bring them back to life in order to judge them? Because the neshama on its own has an alibi, and the guf on its own has an alibi, so God has to put them together to demonstrate how they committed the crime. So that's a very appropriate mashal. But what does it have to do with the carbon chatas? Like, what is the point of the Medrash bringing this mashal in our parsha? What insight does this give us as to how the carbon chatas works? Like, what does that have to do with this subject? Like, why is it just at this place, in the beginning of Perek Daled, as the introduction to the carbon chatas, does it bring this story of the Medrash? You know, there's a very interesting thing. Let's talk about the idea of karas, because the carbon chatas revolves around those averos, which is the chi of karas. There's, what is karas? Torah says for many different averos, the person is cut off. What does karas mean? There's a lot of confusion on this point. In one place, the Gemara brings a pasuk which says, "He kares tikares, he kares ba'olam hazeh, tikares ba'olam haba." The person is cut off from this world. He's cut off from the next world. Taisus and Yavamas, Naf Beis, brings a Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi says that kares means a person dies before the age of 50. He brings the Gemara Moed Katan, which seems to say that he dies between 50 and 60. So kares is first premature death. That's hikares ba'olam hazeh. But in addition to that, there's also some being cut off from the experience of olam haba. Hikares ba'olam haba. Now there's an interesting Ramban. The Ramban on Parshas Achrei Mos says that not every instance of karas is the same. The Ramban says there are 3 different situations of karas. If you have a person who is roiv zechuyas, if he's mostly righteous, but he committed a single aveira, which is a chi of karas, he ate chaylev, for example, so says the Ramban, that person is only cut off from olam hazeh. He experiences premature death, but he will have a full share in olam haba. He doesn't get karas in olam haba. If you have a person who's roiv avaynais, he's mostly sinful, and one of his aveiros includes a chet, like eating chaylev, which is a chi of karas, so then he's cut off only from olam haba. He could live a long, happy life in this world for 100 years old. He's cut off only from olam haba. This that the Gemara says hikares tikares, that you lose both, is only by avodah zarah. That's the sheet of the Ramban. Only by avodah zarah. That's where it's written. It's written by avodah zarah. So there you're cut off from olam hazeh and from olam haba. But kumeduma, the Ramban is a das yochid. The Rambam seems to be beferish in Hilchas Tshuva Parak Tes that the hikares tikares, this drasha, that hikares b'olam hazeh, tikares b'olam haba, is the definition of kares generally. That generally kares involves both premature death in this world and being cut off from the next world. The Ramban is a das yochid. So the question is this two punishments? Like, is that the geder that a person commits such a sin, he gets two punishments? One punishment is premature death in this world, and the other punishment is to be cut off from the bliss of olam haba. Are these really two punishments? Is it one punishment? The Baal Tanya in the Igeres HaTshuva writes an amazing thing. He explains how the hikares tikares, the being cut off from olam hazeh and being cut off from olam haba, really are two consequences of the same thing. And he says an amazing thing. He says that our neshamas receive their chiyus, their vigor, their life from the Ribono Shel Olam. There is a rope, so to speak. There is a chevel that connects our neshamas to the Ribono Shel Olam. He brings the pasuk Yaakov chevel nachlasa, which literally means Yaakov is God's portion, but chevel means a rope. Yaakov is attached by a rope, so to speak, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Baal Tanya puts it in Kabbalic terms. He says that our neshamas are connected to the hay, the final hay of the divine name, whatever that means, through this chevel, through this rope. This rope, says the Baal Tanya, is a braid of 613 strands, which corresponds to the 613 mitzvahs. If we observe the 613 mitzvahs, then this rope is intact, and it is the channel through which we receive life and energy and health, vigor. If we commit an aveira, a specific aveira, one of those strands is broken. So the rope is not as strong as it is meant to be. It should be a rope that's comprised of 613 strands. Instead, it's comprised of 612 strands. It's not as strong. But there are certain aveiras that have the quality that they cut the rope. They sever the rope entirely. Even though they are specific aveiras. It's one of the Taryag mitzvahs, one of the 613 mitzvahs. But the nature of the aveira is so chomer that it severs the rope. It says, that is karas. That is karas. So if I eat chaylev, it's true. Chaylev is only one of the Taryag mitzvahs. I would have thought that maybe it should only damage one of the fibers of the rope. But the nature of an aveira, which is a chi of karas, is that it severs the entire rope. I am totally cut off. Now, when my soul is cut off, there are consequences of this. One consequence is that I die in this world. Because if my soul doesn't have the life force to transmit to the body, then I die. But if my soul dies, it also can't experience the bliss of the world to come. So we're not dealing with two different punishments. We're not dealing with the punishment of death and a second punishment of losing olam haba. It's really two consequences of the same thing. If my connection to God, if my connection to the source of life is severed, then my soul just dies. If my soul dies, it cannot give life to my body in this world. It can't experience the bliss of the next world. So the question is, so why does the person die only years later? Right? It says in the Gemara that he dies before 50, according to the Yerushalmi, according to the Babylon, between 50 and 60. Why not immediate if his soul is cut off? So Latanya gives a beautiful mashal. He says, I'll modernize the mashal. Right? Let's say, for example, you have the battery in your car, and the battery of your car is recharged by the generator. Right? The revolution of the motor recharges the battery. And all of a sudden, something happens, your generator breaks, so the battery is no longer charged. but there's still enough charge in there for the car to operate for another couple hours. In a couple hours, the car will stop. So it's the same thing. Our neshamas receive chiyus, they receive energy from the Ribono Shel Olam. When the cord is severed, there's no more transmission of energy. But there may still be enough energy for the person to survive for a while. On the basis of what he already received. So therefore the person received enough chiyus, there's enough life that his soul already received, even though it's not receiving anymore because the rope has been severed, but there's enough chiyus that he can carry on for another few years. Till he's 50, maybe even till he's 60. And then that's it. Then there isn't enough chiyus and he dies. But Olam Haba he certainly doesn't have. Because beyond that point, the neshama is not being invigorated anymore, there's nothing left. It's an amazing, amazing insight the Baal HaTanya is telling us. But there's one problem. One problem always bothered me with this. According to the Baal HaTanya, the Iker Kares is the being cut off from the Ribono Shel Olam. In other words, it's a severing of that rope that connects the final hay of the divine name to our neshamas. But if you look in the Chumash, in pasuk after pasuk after pasuk, the kares is not described as being cut off from God, it's being cut off from the rest of the Jewish nation. It's being cut off mikerev amai. So how do you understand it? What is the kares? What are you being cut off from? Are you being cut off from God? Or are you being cut off from your nation? And what is the mechanism by which the cutting off takes place? So I think we can understand this in light of another thing the Baal HaTanya writes elsewhere. In the main part of Tanya, Perek Lamed Beis, he says an amazing thing. He says like this, that we know that the conflict between good and evil within us is essentially a tension between the guf and the neshama. The guf has its yearnings. The guf wants pleasure, the guf wants comfort, the guf wants food, it wants sleep. Those are the things the body wants. The soul has its desires. The soul wants spirituality, it wants wisdom, it wants connection to the Ribono Shel Olam. So there's a tug of war, there's a tension between the guf and the neshama. And that's the conflict that every person has to live with. Says the Baal HaTanya, Mitzad HaNeshama, we are all one. We are all connected. We are all connected. Every Jew is connected. We are like branches of the same tree. What separates us is the guf. And this is something which is not an abstract concept. We don't understand that when we talk about material things, physical things, it's a zero-sum game. What you eat, I can't eat. What you enjoy is not available for me to enjoy. And therefore we are competitors for the limited resources of the material world. When it comes to spiritual values, it's a win-win situation. In other words, your spiritual gain is my spiritual gain. Mitzad HaNeshama, we are one. Mitzad the guf, we are separated. And the truth is, Rabbi Yonah already foretold this. Rabbi Yonah comments on a pasuk in Mishlei. It says, "L'tava yivakesh nifrod," that a person who seeks the satisfaction of material desire, he becomes estranged, he becomes separated. And Rabbi Yonah says that the person who seeks spirituality, he's never separated from his fellow man. It can be win-win, because my spiritual gain can be another person's spiritual gain. L'tava, if a person seeks the fulfillment of physical desire, yivakesh nifrod, then he wants to be estranged, he wants to be separate, because what I have, you can't have. There's a limit. You only can slice the pie this many ways, and whatever you take, I can't have. So the Baal HaTanya says an amazing thing, that if a person wants to fulfill the Ohavta l'reach al kamoicha, let's say a person wants to fulfill the mitzvah of loving a fellow Jew to the fullest extent, he has to focus his life on spirituality instead of materialism. In other words, a person who is materialistic, a person who is interested in things of this world, cannot love another person like himself. Because every other person is his competitor. Every other person is taking away from him. So how can he love another person as much as he loves himself? To the contrary, you're depriving me of what I need, what I want. If a person lives a spiritual life, if his quest is for spiritual attainments, then he can love a fellow Jew as much as he loves himself. So let's understand that medrash we're talking about. Like what is the medrash really talking about? Bringing this mashal of the blind man and the lame man and the neshama and the guf. What it's telling us is like this. In the mashal, the blind man becomes the accomplice of the lame man, and vice versa. When we sin, our neshama becomes the accomplice of the guf. That's a very frightful thing. In other words, the guf, kishula atzmo, the guf itself can't do anything. So the guf hijacks the neshama. Now the neshama itself would engage in spiritual pursuits, it wants lofty things, but the guf hijacks the neshama and uses the neshama as its agent, uses its intelligence, uses its ingenuity. That's a very frightening thing. That's a very terrible thing. But that's what happens when we sin. When we sin, the body, in a sense, wins in this tug of war. The challenge of life is to keep the neshama pure, to keep the neshama unentangled from the guf. I once said, I believe that the Maharal explains it, but I could never find it in the Maharal. I don't think I said it, because it's too good. So someone said it. There's a Gemara in Brachos, which says that there are hundreds of different ways to die. Lamavis totzos, hundreds of ways to die. The worst way to die is called askara. Askara is a terrible disease. When a person dies from askara, the Gemara says, is peturi b'fideshet. It's like in the ships, they used to have these holes, and they had ropes going through the holes, and the ropes fit very, very tightly in the hole. So when you pull the rope through the hole, there was a lot of friction. It was very hard to pull it out. Or there's another mashal for askara. The Gemara says, if you have like wool that's caught in a thorn bush, and you're trying to pull those shearing out of the thorn bush, it's entangled in the thorn bush. That's the worst death. Right? The neshama trying to depart the body. The best death is called misas neshika. Misas neshika, the kiss of death, is kimishcha b'nisa mechalba. It's like removing a hair from a glass of milk. Just slides right out. So what's the issue? The issue is exactly this. In other words, if your neshama remains pure, unentangled with the guf, when it's time for the neshama to depart to the next world, the neshama has no problem. It's happy to go. It slides right out. That's misas neshika. It says, but if the body becomes entangled with the neshama, or better, the neshama becomes entangled with the body, so then, just like the guf wants the pleasures of this world, the neshama also wants the pleasures of this world. It doesn't want to go, because it's entangled with the guf. So therefore, when the time for Yetzias neshama comes, when it comes time for the soul to depart, it's agony. It's like pulling the shearing out of the thorn bush. It's like pulling that rope through that very narrow hole. It's a terrible thing. But that's what happens when we sin. When we sin, our neshamas become entangled and encased, encrusted in the guf. When that happens, we are not only cut off from our connection to the Ribono Shel Olam, but we are cut off, as the Baal HaTanya says, from our connection to one another. Right? If even our neshamas become materialistic, then we are disconnected from our fellow Jews. So it's v'nichrisu mikarav amma. We are cut off from the people as well. So it's not a contradiction. The Baal HaTanya understands Vayikra karas is our being cut off from the Ribono Shel Olam. We asked Aida Psukim Ramashma that we're being cut off from the people, So what is the karas? Are we being cut off from God, or are we being cut off from our fellow Jews? The answer is it's one and the same. In other words, when our neshama becomes disconnected from its source, we are disconnected not only from God, we're disconnected from every other Jew. If our neshamas remain spiritual and pure and connected to the source of life, along with the souls of every other Jew, then not only are we connected to God, but we're connected to one another. Right? If our neshamas become encased and encrusted and constrained by the body, if they become captives of the body, the same way we're cut off from God, we are cut off from one another, and that's really the nature of sin. It would seem to me that's what the Medrash is telling us. The Medrash is telling us that is the nature of karas. What happens is that these aveiros have the tendency that they sever our connection totally from the Ribono Shel Olam, to the extent that we're exactly like the neshama, right, which no longer is a tzipor flying around seeking spiritual things. It now has become so entangled with the guf, it's become an accessory of the guf. That's what the Karban Chatas has to make up for. And that's what it's Darchei Chayvei Krisus. The other types of pagam are, I'm not saying minor problems. In other words, if in that chevel, in that rope, there's one strand which is severed, okay, there's one strand which is severed. Right? For that, the Torah is not Machayev of Karban Chatas. No, it's not what it should be. But it's a livable situation. With karas, we are so severed, so cut off from the Ribono Shel Olam, right, that something has to be done. There has to be some eitzah, there has to be some tikkun. And that's what the Karban Chatas is designed to do. The question is, how does the Karban Chatas do it? I think that if we reflect on the symbolism of the Karban Chatas, we can understand. Just like the Balatanya said, if you want to reconnect yourself to every other Jew and reconnect yourself to the Ribono Shel Olam, right, you have to grapple with the material temptations of this world. Because you have to pull yourself away from worldly desire. You have to pull yourself away from the taivas of this world. You have to pull yourself away from the temptations of this world. We think about a carbon. What exactly is a carbon? We take an animal. An animal also is a guf and a neshama. But what do we do in the ritual of the carbon? First we slaughter the carbon, and we take the blood, and we offer it on the mizbeach. What is the blood? The blood is the nefesh. The blood is the neshama. The ritual of the carbon is really removing the neshama from its entanglement with the guf. That's what the ritual of the carbon is. If you slaughter an animal, and you drain its blood, you take its blood, and you elevate the blood to the altar, what you've essentially done is you've separated the neshama from the guf. You've released the neshama from its entanglement with the guf, and now it functions as a pure neshama. Now that's symbolic. But if a person reflects on the symbolism and understands that's what I meant to do, right? I meant to stop using my neshama as an accomplice of the guf, but instead let the neshama exist in its pure spiritual state. The most beautiful symbol of that is the avodah sadam. That's what we do with the blood of a carbon. We take the blood, we drain it from the animal, we offer it on the mizbeach. Essentially what we're saying is that this blood, which is the symbol of the neshama, is disengaged, disentangled from its connection to the guf. But then we take other parts of the animal. We take the meat, the body of the animal, and we take parts from the inside, and we burn that on the altar. That also is symbolic of a separation. And it's interesting to know that among the parts we take are the fat and the kidneys. And the kidneys, we know, Chazal tell us, the kidneys, in the metaphor of Chazal, are also the seat of very deep thoughts. Kloyos yoatzos, the kidneys which give counsel. You know, we tend to think that where is the neshama seated? Maybe the neshama is seated in the head, in the brain. but there is a gut feeling, so to speak. There's also something which is rooted in the kloyos, in the kidneys. We take the kidneys with the surrounding fat and burn it on the altar. We're also separating the neshama, if you will, from the guf. But even in a third sense, we're doing that. When we take something physical, we burn it on the mizbeach, and it merges with the fire and the smoke. Essentially, what we're doing is we are taking the energy from the thing and we are releasing it. That's what every fire is, right? Every fire releases the energy contained in the combustible material. That is symbolic of the disentanglement, the disengagement of the neshama from the guf. It's all symbolic, but if a person reflects on that and understands that the purpose of my intelligence, the purpose of my spirit, the purpose of my drive is not to make more money and to live more comfortably and to satisfy my physical needs or desires to a greater extent, but that's the purpose is to live a life of spirituality, a life of Torah, a life of mitzvahs, a life of avoda, right? That's the tikkun. And it's symbolized by the rituals of the carbon chatas. But now the question is, but how do you do that? Okay, it's one thing that you wish to disengage and separate the soul from the body. But what do you do with the body? How do you do that? How do you suppress the relentless demands of the body? Well, there are two mahalachim. One mahalach is self-denial, right? In other words, that you simply, in a sense, crush the body. That, of course, is symbolized by the burning of what's left after you remove the amorim. When we remove the blood, we remove the kidneys with the fat. What do we do with the rest of the animal? In the case of the Parkai and Mashiach and Bahalam Dover Shal Tzibur, you just burn it, right? Burning something means that you destroy it. But there's also another way you can suppress the yearnings of the body, which is by becoming a person who is not self-centered, but rather being a person who is devoted to the needs of others. In other words, when we pursue gashmias, when we pursue materialism for ourselves, that corrupts. When we pursue material things to help other people, that ennobles us. And therefore, when the meat of the carbon is taken and given to the kaihanim to eat, that means that the guf and its material yearnings are really redirected not to the service of ourselves, not to self-service, but to the service of others. That's also a tikkun to the question of the yearnings of the body. As a person who wishes to become a spiritual person, spirituality is not only in Torah and tefillah and in lofty and meditation and contemplation, right? A person can live a very spiritual life, right? Even if he's working in the business world, even if he's producing material products. As long as he understands he's not doing it for himself, he's doing it for others. So that devotion to the material needs of others is spirituality itself. And that's the idea that the basar is now given to the kahanim to eat. And that, of course, is the idea that we mentioned. This is why the replacement for the carbon chatas can be chesed. That when we had a Beis HaMikdash, it was the mizbeach that was mechaper. So it's the shulchan that's mechaper, the shulchan on which we feed the poor. Right? As Rabbi Eliezer says, the requirement of Yisurin can be satisfied with chesed. It's the same idea. How does Yisurin affect tikkun? Because Yisurin, as the Maral explains in the Nasiva Soilam, Yisurin crush the body. Right? Yisurin shatter the illusion that we can have all the material pleasure we want. In other words, the person who is satisfied and complacent thinks, yeah, I can live a life of material happiness. The person who's the Baal Yisurin understands that it's hopeless, it's purposeless. If I'm going to try to live a life of material comfort, he says, I can't. Right? I'm racked by Yisurin. the only thing the Bal Yisurin turns to is the spiritual side of life, because that's the only thing he can experience. Yisurin also is a very powerful way of restoring the soul to its spiritual place. But the requirement of Yisurin can also be made up with tzedakah. That's the chesed yuchupar oven. That through charity, if a person works, even if he works hard, even if he spends long hours in material pursuits, but he's doing it not for himself, he's doing it for others, the pursuit of material success and wealth for others is also a form of spirituality. But the main point is that this is the idea of the carbon chatas, and maybe this is the idea of karbanos b'chlal. The idea of the carbon is exactly this: we are dealing with the animal, which is the dualism of guf and neshama, of body and soul. We are separating and disentangling the neshama from the body in three ways. First, through the avodas hadam, taking the blood, separating the blood, which is the nefesh, separating the emurim, which are symbolic of those, that deep seat of the nefesh in the guf, burning that on the altar and setting the rest aside, and finally the burning of the emurim on the altar, which again separates the energy that's contained within from the material residue which is left behind. That is the whole idea of a carbon. The whole idea of a carbon is to disentangle the neshama from the guf, and especially the carbon chatas, because the person who is nichshel in the chi of kares, that's exactly the situation, right? Through his becoming shakua, becoming sunk in material temptation, he has totally separated, he's cut the rope, so to speak, that connects him to spirituality, which enables him to be connected to God, which enables him to be connected to every other Jew. He becomes estranged. That's what the essence of what karas is. The restoration of that is the reflection on what the symbol of what the carbon chatos symbolizes.